They called her just the help long enough that the name became a thing she could wear without thinking of it as a weight. It fit over her like an old coat, faded at the seams, patched at the elbow, but it kept the rain out and the chill away. She moved through the long rooms and short streets of Dry Creek like a soft shadow, hands busy, jaw set, eyes steady. Her hair was braided because there was never time for anything else. Her boots were plain and scuffed. Her fingers were cracked and stubborn. She kept the coffee hot and the stove clean. She kept the ledger tidy and the beds pulled straight. She kept quiet, and that quiet carried a kind of truth the town was too loud to hear. The town itself had a name that made it sound smaller than it was, a speck of dust on a map, a place where two-lane roads met the prairie and slowed to a walk. Dry Creek Saloon was a long, low building with a sign that leaned like an old man and a set of doors that creaked in a way everybody knew by heart. Inside, the lamplight pooled over the bar and made the brandy bottles gleam like tiny suns. The smell of wood smoke and whiskey made an honest promise of warmth and dullness. The piano in the corner was out of tune, but it was not the tune that mattered. It was the playing, the way men leaned on it and let their fingers fall where the notes would or would not be. The quiet cowgirl, Mary Ellen Crow, though most called her Ellen because Mary felt too young for the life she'd had, was the backbone of that saloon and of a host of other things no one else wanted to do. She cooked for the farrier when they worked late. She dried the preacher's wife's tears once when a baby died. She patched shirts, washed blood out of collars, and mended saddles no one remembered to keep. People spoke over her. They did not mean harm so much as habit. When a person is steady and does not demand attention, a town will learn to treat them like furniture, useful, expected, and unnoticed. On a late summer evening when the sky sat heavy with the storm the weather bell said was coming, Ellen moved through her chores with the same quiet attention as the years before. Rain would be coming. The air smelled of dust and the faint sweetness of cut hay drying in the barn. She had tied back her braid, sleeves rolled up to the elbow to show the seams of new patches, and the stove radiated a steady warmth that filled the room like a deep, held breath. The kettle hissed and spat. The tin mugs pinged against the counter. A cat nosed the edge of a pile of rags and left the place smelling faintly of fur. Boots thudded on the worn boards. A chair scraped, and the doors sighed open. That night the saloon held more men than usual. Drifters, ranch hands, the sheriff who liked to feel important, and a woman with hands manicured but eyes hard like flint, Mrs. Hargrave, whose family owned the grain store and half the opinions in town. Mrs. Hargrave liked to talk in a voice that suggested she did not have to do any work to understand it. She liked to tidy people with words, a clipped here, a flutter of a hand there, a look that tightened around other people like a noose. "She's got the will of a mule," one of the men said to Mrs. Hargrave without looking at Ellen, who was already moving among the tables with coffee and apple tarts. "Stubborn mule. But you can tell she's plain. Can't fix plain. Plain's a blessing," Mrs. Hargrave said, polishing the rim of her glass with a napkin as if cleaning could make the town purer. "Plain keeps men honest. Too pretty and they expect things. Plain you can trust to stay in place. Ain't that right, John?" John, a man who had once been a schoolteacher and now tended the livery, chuckled without looking up. "I reckon, if you don't ask for attention, they'll never give it." Ellen heard them. She'd heard it many times, enough that it scraped but did not singe. She set a coffee in front of Mrs. Hargrave and smoothed the napkin without meeting her eyes. Her hands knew how to move through insult as if it were dirt on the floor. You sweep it under the rug, and later you sweep it back out. The saloon lucre hummed and the piano moaned when a cowboy pushed at it with one heavy hand. Out on the boardwalk, the wind was tuning itself for a storm. "They call her just the help?" a voice said from the doorway, low and edged with wood smoke. He had a coat that had seen better springs and a hat that fit him like a thought. He rode as if he belonged to no place but the saddle, as if the wind was a familiar hand on his shoulder. The men in the room quieted a little when he spoke. Not because they feared him, their kind of fear had names and debts, but because he carried a look the town had trouble unraveling. The look of someone who had been in battles nobody wanted to speak of and lived through them without ceremony. The buried past cowboy, call him Luke Hargrove, had drifted into Dry Creek like driftwood. He'd been around long enough for people to remember different things about him. Some claimed he was a former outlaw who'd lost more than a few friends to his recklessness. Others said he'd been a soldier, carrying a silence that made men uncomfortable. He kept his jaw set so his teeth didn't show, and his eyes were the color of river silt after rain, murky but steady. When he spoke now, it was a remark meant to stir, but his voice held a softness that fooled nobody and comforted nearly everyone. "I reckon she's the only one in this town with a real backbone," he said. "Keeps the pot on the stove and the doors open. Ain't likely she'd go making trouble for anyone." Mrs. Hargrave's lip curled. "You sound like you're giving compliments to furniture, Mr. Hargrove. Don't be soft. This town needs people who know their place." There was laughter, the sort that tacks itself to the end of a sentence to make a point. Ellen kept moving, but the sound of it felt like a stone dropped into a jar of water and sent ripples out toward everything she'd learned to keep steady. She poured coffee for Luke without thinking. He never raised his hand for it, but he took the cup as if receiving a gift. "You been writing?" she asked, spare, always businesslike. "A while," he said. He breathed the steam as if savoring something he rarely allowed himself. "Thought I'd stay till the rain passed." "You always pick the weather just before it gets sour," Mrs. Hargrave said. "Careful, Mr. Hargrove. Folks might think you're courting storms." Luke smiled once, quick and brief, like a lightning flash. "Maybe I am." Ellen set the cup down and moved on. Her life was framed by chores that had no applause. Sweeping, mending, lifting. Washing a man's shirt after a night of drink and blood. Wiping lipstick off a collar. Sharing bread with a child who smelled of river mud. The saloon was a half-home for her because men would drink and forget in its lamplight. And the saloon always needed someone to remember. She stood at the sink at the back where the light from the small lidless window fell in thin, honest slats. The steam from the kettle fogged the glass and made little ghosted circles where fingers had pressed to peek out. Outside, a horse neighed once and the sound rolled like a hesitant promise. It was there she saw the boy. The boy was small and ragged and looked like he might have been put together from other people's leftovers. He had an eye scrape and a gap in his front teeth where a grown man's fist could have fit. His boots were 2 sizes too big. He stood on the wrong side of the saloon's threshold as if waiting to be allowed in. People noticed him, then unnoticed him, because Dry Creek had more mouths than beds and folded children into its hunger without always trying to feed them. "He came from the hollow," said someone near the bar. "Ran off. Parents probably handed him down to life." "You let him in," Mrs. Hargrave said, voice tight with the kind of moral austere she kept polished like her silverware. "You don't know what he'll bring." Ellen felt something hook loose in her chest. She was not one to make a spectacle. She did not give away money she did not have or promises she could not keep. But she also had been a child once with her shoes full of holes and her belly full of the kind of hunger that made a body lean toward kindness because kindness was, in those moments, a shape of survival. She opened the door. "Come on in," she said, brisk and neutral like any other instruction. The boy blinked. His tongue flicked at a cut lip. He stepped inside as if afraid of being taken back to the cold. Ellen wiped her hands on her apron and fetched a tin mug steaming with coffee that was mostly hot water and mostly goodwill. She pushed it to the boy and watched him inhale as if it were a lantern held to his face. In Dry Creek, warm cups were small mercies. The boy did not take up all the room in the saloon. He fit in the little hollow people left for children of the wrong side of town. Mrs. Hargrave's voice rose a little. "What are you doing? You can't just invite every vagrant off the road to sit at the tables." Ellen felt the muscles in her jaw tighten but said nothing. The boy's shoulders dropped a fraction. He sipped, and the steam fogged the air between him and Mrs. Hargrave like a quiet rebuke. The men at the bar returned to their game with a new softness, the sort men get when they think someone else will clean up the world's messes. Luke watched. He had watched quietly before. He watched now not because he was novel and romantic but because watching was how he measured the country. There is a kind of accounting men learn in the saddle. Who is steady, who is loose, who will bend to the wind and who will break. Ellen moved like someone who had practiced long to stay intact. The boy drank, the coffee warmed him. Nobody did more than look away. Later that week Ellen would learn the boy's name. Tommy. Would learn how he'd run from a home that had more scolding than supper, and less love than should have been allotted by law of God and decency. For now she only knew the smallness of the boy and the thickness of the town's eyes around him. She had placed the cup of coffee between the boy and the world and sat in the edges of the room like a steady rock. Kindness like that often costs somebody. It cost Ellen a look, a public eyes on her that made her face go cold. It made Mrs. Hargrave's voice a wire more brittle. The town had rules about whom to help, and these rules were enforced by gossip and glances and social ledgers no bank could reckon. But kindness is stubborn in its own way. It grows teeth. The storm arrived at last. It came in a sweep of wind and rain that rattled the glass and sent dust flying into the corners. The piano in the saloon played a few sour chords before a lightning strike made the thin panes feel as if they might bow. The men left their drinks and stepped out into the wet, because a man needs to see his horse is fed and his weather is known. The saloon emptied until only a handful remained. The regulars who had nowhere better to go, Mrs. Hargrave who needed to watch the town's property like a hawk, the boy who had wanted the warmth, Ellen who never left the table until the last dish was dry. When the rain slackened to a tapestry of mist, the door opened and two men came in. The sheriff, a man whose badge seemed like a bright coin against his chest and whose tongue turned quickly to business, and his deputy, who always laughed at the wrong time and whose laugh could make a joke into a dead thing. "There's a family out by the hollow," the sheriff said. Hat still wet, voice measured. "House burned down. Need some blankets and a pot if anyone's able. Thought maybe the saloon could spare." "Blankets," Mrs. Hargrave said with a hand over her mouth. "We can't be handing out blankets like they're candy. People would come in droves." "They're children," the sheriff said, like a bell ringing slow and plain. "A mother and her two small ones." Ellen heard the word children and stood straighter. Her hands were quiet at her sides. She remembered a night where she had been small enough to count the stars and think they were winks from better people. She'd been fed by a neighbor once who had kept her from the cold even when there was nothing to give. The memory sat in her like a warm stone. "I'll go," Ellen said before she could weigh the town's ledger of who deserved what. Her voice surprised her by how plain it sounded. It was a speech of mechanics. This is needed, this is what one does. Mrs. Hargrave looked ready to protest. But Luke cleared his throat and pushed his hat back from his forehead with a palm that had calluses and scars like thin road maps. "She's the one to go," he said to the sheriff. He did not say it like he was lending advice. He said it like he was stating a fact. "It's a storm out there," the sheriff said. "You sure, miss?" "Ellen," she said. "Miss Ellen, you don't need to be getting yourself out in that." "I'll be fine," she said. "I don't mind." There was something that happened in the room then. A small shift as if a table that had been slightly askew had been nudged into place. The sheriff nodded, and they fetched blankets and bowls and a kettle that was still warm from the stove. Ellen wrapped her coat tighter because she was too sensible to believe in miracles and too stubborn to be afraid of rain. They rode out toward the hollow with a lantern swinging from the saddle that made the edges of the road feel softer. The horses' breaths came in little puffs that faded into the mist. Ellen rode with her hands in her lap. Her face was pale but steady. The hollow smelled like smoke and damp hay. The house was a skeleton of char, walls leaning like bowed shoulders. A woman sat on an overturned crate with a bundle of something held tight to her chest. Two children huddled against her knees, shivering and eyes huge with the kind of sorrow that comes when everything a child knows changes all at once. Ellen knelt and offered the blankets. The woman took them with hands that trembled in a way that did not belong to someone who had always had comforts. She pressed them to her children like something saintly, like the warmth of a memory. The rain kept the world soft and private. There were no men in the world now but those who had come to help. "You came," the woman said, voice airy with relief. She looked at Ellen like one might look at a neighbor who had a spare ladder. The woman had mud up the sleeves of her dress and tears on the hem of her skirt. "I came," Ellen said, and the words were simple and honest as bread. The town would gossip later about this. How Ellen had gone out into a storm for strangers, how she'd moved with a swift, pure kind of urgency nobody else bothered to summon. Mrs. Hargrave tooted and said things about standards. The sheriff told the tale in a low voice to anyone who would listen, calling Ellen a good sort, which is Dry Creek's highest compliment when spoken like that. Luke watched from the doorway as Ellen handed the woman a cup of warmed coffee from a billy that had been sitting on a small fire. The steam rose and wrapped the night like a small promise. He saw the way the woman's shoulders dropped and the way the children's small faces lost the hard, abrupt alertness they'd carried. He saw a relief move across the mother's face that felt like a blessing. Something moved in Luke then. Something not yet a desire but not merely curiosity. He admired such steadiness. He admired it like a man might admire an oak that withstood many seasons. He thought of his own past, lessons learned in a school of hard and painful decisions. He had run once, hard and without looking back, and he had come to Dry Creek with pockets empty of romance and full of things he hadn't yet named. Watching Ellen provide what she had without fuss or needs struck a bell inside him that the years had not yet rung. They returned in silence with blankets strapped and a kettle emptied and hearts eased of their tightness. The town would speak about it then, and in the weeks after it would be an ingredient in the legend of the quiet girl who did more than was asked. But for Ellen it was another night stitched into the long fabric of days. Another thing to be done. Cities and towns have a way of repaying kindness with gossip or reward. Dry Creek was not kind in the measured way. It repaid with a sharpened curiosity and a series of small insults. People who liked rules got louder when a person broke them without permission. Mrs. Hargrave was among those, and her displeasure took the form of sharp comments and pointed looks. "You'll let people in now, start handing out blankets like charity, and where will the town be?" she'd say to anyone who would listen. The thing about Dry Creek was that kindness was tolerated only when it came from the right sort of person. When it came from someone like Ellen, plain, steady, unbent by reputation, it stirred something in the small-town ledger that people who counted social capital resented. Then, a week after the Hollow incident, something else happened that would change the tenor of the town and the course of Ellen's life. The stagecoach from the nearest city rolled in late with a passenger who, through the course of a few unfortunate wagers and an ill-timed dispute, had found himself in trouble. He was a man with money and the habit of speaking with important-sounding vowels. He did not like the saloon's shade and must be made to feel that he had been slighted. He wanted the saloon to show him its respect, and when the saloon's respect was apportioned among a room it presumed to order things, the man demanded more. He spoke up about the coffee being cold and about the chair being a fit only for animals. He singled Ellen out with the kind of thin public criticism that acts like acid on dignity. "What is it?" he demanded when a bone-deep hush followed his complaint. "That you lot keep about housekeeping? You keep the floors, you swab the dishes, you keep the light on for us? Who keeps the respect?" "No one," Mrs. Hargrave called out dryly. "They keep that inside their pockets." Ellen had been moving. She water-socked a mop in a bucket and wrung it out the way her hands knew best. Not with show but with effectiveness. She had seen complaints before and had learned to let them pass through like flies. But this one landed with a weight. The man stood with a drink angled like a weapon in his hand and meant for the room to applaud a pointlessness he thought equal to wit. "It's the kind of place that needs the right people," he continued, looking around the room with greedy eyes. "There should be a better class of help. Someone who looks like their job contributes to their worth." There was a stir of laughter, and Mrs. Hargrave, with a precision like a surgeon's, leaned in to dissect the insult further. "We can tell the difference at a glance," she said. "This town isn't for sentimentalities." The bar was loud enough to drown out voices like their importance. The men who had not a stake in the etiquette of the room were looking away, their attention smothered by the smell of liquor and the need for their own orders. But there are moments in a small town where someone in the crowd will take a slice of paper and hold it until things are explained. A man tossed his hat onto the piano and shrugged as if the world was not his to take care of. Ellen stood with the mop and looked at the man for a long moment. There is a way of looking that makes you known. She had learned it. The man's eyes met hers and found her to be an inconvenience rather than a person. "You know what everyone's problem is?" he huffed, loud enough now that the room settled like a field at harvest. "They forget their place. There should be more pride. More dignity." Ellen answered in the only way she had learned to when words would not be of use if she met them half-measured. She turned and set the mop bucket to the side and walked to the back where the small wooden cupboard held a pot of stew simmering for anyone hungry enough to ask. She ladled and she set plates out on the long table. She did not shout. She did not insult. She did the work she had to do, feeding those who sat and listened. There was a sound in the room, little and potent, as if someone had struck a small bell. The men at the bar shifted in their seats. They liked things to be tidy and were not pleased when tidy rules were not the ones they had invented. The man with the voice smiled and tossed back his whiskey as if making a point. "There's nothing in this place that would tell me thanks." You could see it then, the ease with which authority and cruelty dressed themselves. The man's jab was not a single strike but a slow erosion that peeled away at something in the room like a wind moving over unprotected paint. He drew his words like a knife and intended them to make Ellen's face flush with shame. She felt the burn start like iron on skin but kept her expression controlled. That was what she did. Keep the pot hot, the stove burning, and her mouth shut enough to avoid giving someone else a spectacle. Then a laugh that had no humor hit the room. It was sneering and raw, and it required no thought. It came from Mrs. Hargrave, sharp as a trimming knife. "If she's so good, she'd be running a hotel in the city," she said, not scouring flour from her hands under lamplight. There were others who joined in, a chorus painted with small-town righteousness. The man smiled as if he'd won a competition he hadn't entered. Ellen heard each word like a pebble in her shoe. Small, persistent, maddening. She kept her hands busy and her eyes unfocused like someone stacking hay before the storm. The hurt lodged like a splinter. She had learned the tricks of living with such things, acceptance like armor, and yet there are times when the accumulation of small cruelties draws a line that must be crossed. She felt eyes on her then, Luke's. He had watched the exchange like a man watching a steed being prodded for a fault. Something in him pulled taut at what his own experience taught him about worth and what the world promises about men and their use. He had been skinned by dishonor before, and he had learned to gauge what was worth defending. Sometimes, defense is a small gesture. It is not always roaring swords and dramatic rescues. This time Luke's intervention was a voice. He stood, set his coffee down carefully, and the room felt the change like the low before rain. "Now that's enough," he said. The words were quiet, but they moved across the room like a bolting horse. The man who'd been preening frowned. People who act cruelly like to see no consequence for their tone. When there is consequence, they become small, uncomprehending. "You keep your voice for your lady friends," Luke said, voice edged with something colder than amusement. He did not raise his voice. He simply put a hand on the bar and looked at the man as if making a ledger entry. This man had misbehaved. "You mind your business," the man replied, taken aback that anyone would dare intrude. "This is a public place." "I have. You got a habit of talking over women and calling it opinion," Luke said, plain-spoken. "If you want respect, you'd start by giving it." The room pressed still with the air of expectation that comes before a gun is drawn or a chair thrown. The man's face flushed like a cheap grape. He looked at Luke as if deciding whether to make a performance of his anger. Pride is a thing that can shift a man from a flawed citizen to a dangerous one with little more than a word or a look. "You got yourself in the wrong place," he said finally. "Best be watching your tongue." The sheriff moved a fraction. Men weigh a plain voice differently, like an old scale. The man took another drink. Glare settled back into his face like a cloak. He had not expected anyone to meet him, especially not a person the town thought to be a furniture piece. He had expected the room to laugh with him, to let him stand like a king and issue decrees. When that did not happen, he slunk a little in his boots. Private triumph turned to an uncertain anger. Ellen did not smile. She did not look triumphant. But something in the room had shifted from discomfort to attention. The men began to talk about their horses and the weather, clearing their throats and making the man's words seem less meaningful. Mrs. Hargrave pursed her lips and took an affront onto her cheek, as if it were a thing she had to minister to. The man muttered and picked up his hat like a damaged bird and left before he was forced to do anything more than listen to his own retreat. When the door closed behind him, the room breathed out together. The piano started again, the lamp burned steady, and people resumed their drinks with a little less swagger. Nobody clapped, nobody had to. The simple act of refusing an insult to be invisible was enough. People like that had to be told they were wrong for reasons that were not dramatically announced. Luke sat down again, and his hands smoothed over the brim of his hat. He did not look at Ellen with the hungry admiration of a man newly in love. He looked at her with the mild recognition that someone markers of worth could be refilled. She had not asked for him to interfere. She had not expected it. The small thing he had done for her cost him nothing but a voice. But it had the power of reprieve. For the first time, perhaps, in a long time, Ellen felt the sting of humiliation eased by someone else's intervention. "You didn't have to," she said when he handed back a cup and resumed his chair. Her voice was calm, almost neutral, but there was a warmth gathering in her chest that was not steam from the coffee. She had been carried by years of doing that which needed to be done, and here was a man who had read the books of her life and decided a single page deserved a margin note. "I didn't have to stand by and listen to a man show his ugly parts," he said. "Seems like a poor display." She gave a small, private smile that did not aim to be sweet. "We live with the ugly," she answered. Her fingers flexed around the mug. "We try to keep it small." Luke nodded and took a sip. The two of them sat, watching the lamplight make small ovals and listening to the rain make the world soft at the edges. The night was a kind of thaw between them. Words were thin bridges that might or might not carry a person across. They had been steadied together by the small act of standing, like two hands holding a battered fence rail tight. After that night, things in Dry Creek did not change overnight. Small towns are slow as molasses. They are sheets that take time to press out creases. Yet a pattern started to form. A pair of eyes that noticed her when nobody else did. A pair of hands that helped in silence rather than making everything into a spectacle. Luke began to show up in the saloon with a steadying regularity, sometimes for coffee, sometimes because the weather forced him to stay. He would lean his elbows on the bar and let the conversation wash over him. He watched Ellen move like someone listening for music in a language he did not know but guessed the contours of. Sometimes he brought news. He would recount in low, measured sentences the state of the roads, the price of hay, the rumor of a dispute at the Carter place. He kept his story to one line and never lingered on himself. It was in the spaces between his words that Ellen saw the maps of his life. A road to somewhere he was not proud to name and a well of silence that ran deep as a drought-worn creek. She observed him, too, like a person noting something necessary in a weathered barn. Admiration for sturdy things. The town whispered their own guesses about him. An outlaw, a widower, a soldier. That is how small towns work. They fill the blanks with familiar shapes. But he was not a man of many confessions. He had taken to leaving small signs of his watchfulness. A bucket of clean water by the barn, a sack of feed left on the porch with a plain nod in the dawn. He would do these things without ceremony and without any flourish. Ellen felt something in him like a draft from a divided house, cool and practical, keeping people from collapsing into ruin. A kind of friendship, honest and unflamboyant, grew between them. It was a slow burning of proximity. Shared tasks, shared silences, the way a hand might brush a shoulder when lifting a pail. They did not exchange florid compliments or grand promises. Their conversation was spare. Weather, chores, the minor catastrophes of ranch life. Yet the more they were near, the more pieces of each other came to be known. The scar on Luke's knuckle, the careful way Ellen held her breath for a second when she saw a child in need, the manner in which she would not look away from a mess until it was cleared. One evening, as the wheat fields shimmered like an ocean in a late-day sun, Ellen was at the edge of the town, mending the fence that kept the cows from wandering off. Her hands were dirty with sap and sun. her shirt damp at the collar. Luke rode up with a sack slung over his shoulder. The horse's coat shone like a promise waxed, and the day's light made his silhouette a good solid. He dismounted and walked toward her with that sure, silent gait. "You should be resting," he said, more a statement than a question. "You were at the Hollow last week. Reckon you ought to let someone else take a turn. You know how barns never stop needing something," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "People need fences. You don't need to do it all," he said it like a simple truth. She laughed at that, soft and small. "Someone's got to keep the town from going to pieces," she said. "Might as well be me. Might as well be someone who won't mind the doing." "You don't mind because you're made of it," he said. There was no accusation in his voice. There was only observation. The fence needed more than hands. It needed wood. Luke set the sack down and pushed it toward her. Inside were nails and lengths of board he had purchased, simple things that fed the small needs of a country. Ellen blinked, surprised. His quiet ways of offering were not the loud, sweeping kind of generosity the town would brag about. They were like the rain that comes for 3 days straight. Steady, unseen in detail but changing everything when you look back. "You didn't have to," she said. "You didn't have to be out here alone," he countered. She looked at him then, and there was a gratitude that did not flare like fireworks but settled like a hearth. "Thank you," she said. He nodded like someone taking attendance of the world. There was much about both of them that the other did not know, and perhaps they never would. Some histories are like transplants that take time to root. Others are like the bones a man keeps in his pocket, small, heavy, private. But some things began to stitch between them. Not promises, not vows, but small certainties. When a town begins to bend toward the good, it often starts with small acts. A fence mended, a kettle shared, a voice raised for someone who cannot raise one for themselves. Not everything swelled gently. A storm, real and personal, arrived like winter in the middle of harvest when it came visitation time to Ellen's past. Someone had written a letter that carried news with the quiet cruelty of a salt wind. It was from a man who had once called her daughter's name in a way that hurt to remember. It said things that dredged up memories Ellen had buried. A husband who had left her with a debt and a name that fit, for a while, like a yoke. The letter said she had been left with a farm that was a thin thing at the throat, bills like hungry mouths, and options like stones sorted by the highway. She kept the letter folded in her apron as if in secret. Nobody needed to know the ledger of her debts. She had learned to manage them by nights spent knitting, mending, taking in washing at the price of a cup of coffee. When Luke found the paper by accident as he baited the trap for a broken latch and his hand brushed against it, his face did not show shock. Instead it showed a kind of recognition that stung like honesty. "Your past is making its rounds," he said simply, placing the paper back in her apron with a gentleness that felt like a bridle. "It always does," she answered. "Things you try to bury like seeds." Her voice softened. "They have a way of poking through the soil again." Luke sat a while on the fence. He didn't ask prying questions. He did not offer the kind of advice men give when they want to make themselves sound grand. He listened, as if listening were a brave thing and a necessary one. Ellen told him more than she had meant to, about a husband who had run off with a promise and a debt, and about how she had stayed behind like a tree to prop the rest of the farm, and a child who had not yet earned the right to be called a man. The words came in small parcels, some clumsy, some perfectly formed. She spoke in the thin, steady sentences she had used to run her life. He listened like a man reading a ledger aloud, slowly, carefully, making sure he understood each line. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said when she stopped. It was not an accusation or a comfort so much as a statement of truth. He allowed that truth to lie between them and be felt like a warm stone. "I did what I had to do," she said. "That's all." They sat a while longer, the sky fat with the promise of rain. There was a feeling that many small things were too stubborn to change, yet here was one that might. Luke's presence was not an answer, but it was an opening. He was steady where things had been loose. He was a hand placed on an axle to help it turn. That night the town dealt its usual trades in gossip. It also found moments to be ugly. Mrs. Hargrave, never shy when she smelled a weakness she could peddle for advantage, made a jest at the saloon about Ellen's knack for collecting men's pity. "If she's as poor as she looks," she said, "I'd reckon there's a reason. Folks don't stay poor if they're cunning." The remark was a throw of a rock into still waters. It hit a ripple and the ripple moved. Some people laughed, some looked away, some frowned. Ellen felt the sharp way laughter can settle into your bones and rake a memory. She kept her face steady and moved like a shadow through the lamplight. A young boy at a table, Tommy, glared at the mocking woman as if a small, unfair thing were being said in his presence. He had come to the saloon that day for a warm meal. He had not expected to be taught the fine distinctions of social cruelty. It was children who watch everything when adults forget that their eyes are not resting. Luke's jaw tightened and the grace in his hands became a readiness he could not always keep to himself. The heat that rose was less about Ellen and more about the principle that people not be tortured by small cruelties, and called it conversation. He stood. When he spoke, his voice was a low thing that made people turn their heads the way sheep turn their whole bodies toward a shepherd. "You think that's clever?" he asked, voice low enough that only people closest heard. "Name-calling to make you feel bigger? Ain't an accomplishment. It's a habit you learned from some poor upbringing." Mrs. Hargrave's nostrils flared. "Mind your manners," she snapped. "Manners are called for," Luke said, "but you don't buy them with insults." There was a tension. In that room, habits have power and sometimes courage has to cross a field of small barbs to do anything. Luke's intervention cost him the faint warmth of people's approval. He had no right to stand up for Ellen beyond being a neighbor who had chosen to see the ledger in a different light. But he did stand, and once a man starts to speak against cruelty, others either follow or recede. The room shifted in a pattern like a flock. Later, when the saloon thinned and men went out in the warm night to their horses, Ellen found herself at the edge of the river, hands in the cool water, thinking. Luke joined her with a blanket draped over his arm. He did not come with words. He came with the blank space that allows two people to gather their thoughts. "You didn't have to defend me," she said without looking up. "No," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him then. The moonlight made his jaw look like a landmass drawn in pencil. Distinct, honest. "You make it seem easy." "It wasn't," he answered, truth as modest as a coin. "Not to say I do not like to be right." They sat in a silence that was not empty. The water murmured and the frog called from the bank like a small commentator on the world's affairs. Words were not the instrument to build their connection anymore. It was the small thread of mutual acknowledgement. Over the next months, Dry Creek brewed with a slow tenderness. The town's ledger of who deserved what shifted under the influence of small acts. People began to see Ellen differently. Not because she looked different, but because the stories about her started to contain new lines. The Hollow family received further help when the town found necessities were cheaper in shared hands. A woman at the general store who once closed her blinds to the poor began to leave a small pot of meal at her back door. The sheriff, who had a reputation for only being moved by the law, lent a hand when a barn collapsed at Porter's Place. And through it all, Luke remained like a calm weather vane. He did not shout from the roof. He offered what he could: feed, water, a hand with repairs, and comforted with small, precise words. At night he and Ellen would sit in the saloon near the stove and listen to old men tell the kind of stories that make a room blossom into history. Sometimes they would walk along the riverbanks and talk in low phrases about the state of the world. His attention felt like a kind of currency she had never been allowed to earn before. It did not rush her into anything grand. Yet the town as a living thing has demands of its own. It tolerates kindness only when it does not threaten its sense of shape. There are times when generosity meets the hard stone of the status quo and is met with a shove. The man who had been insulted months before returned to Dry Creek after a rumor-laden summer abroad. He found a town largely unchanged, and he decided he would remake the world in the rub of his heel. He wanted to be seen as a man of importance again, and so he drew a line he believed would restore his place. He chose to reclaim the saloon's favor by sparking a scandal. An argument about a horse escalated into threats and then into an edge of violence. This time he pushed further, wanting a spectacle that would align the town against those who refused to make his words the law. He targeted Ellen for a reason he would call subtle and which, in truth, had less to do with her and more to do with her new protector. It is a dangerous thing to misjudge a town's forces. Cruelty breeds in some people like mold in the damp. They do not want to be corrected because their words sustain them. They want a world that shows them to be large. One night, when the lamplight made the men's faces look soft and the piano was playing a tune that remembered better times, he struck Ellen with a verbal cruelty meant to humiliate. A hurtful lie about her past, the sort that claws and digs in places family names do not like to be dug. The lie was layered with implication and meant to pull the town's scorn toward her like a tide. Men who like to watch others fall to feel better about themselves laughed. Women who found comfort in that same schadenfreude nodded. Tickets sold to a private show. The town was hungry for theater. Ellen stood as if the room were a weathered field and a storm had been picked up to strike it. The words pulled at something in her chest like a flag being ripped. Her hands clenched and then relaxed into lines of muscle. She had been defeated before, by flood and debt and a husband who'd tied her to a life she hadn't chosen. This time, the humiliation felt like an old ghost rubbing against muscles she'd made to be steady. She swallowed and the sound of the world narrowed to her breath. Luke did not rise immediately. When he did, it was with a measured pace. His voice was low at first, but it went through the room and was not gentle. "You don't get to speak about her like that," he said. "You going to tell me about my business?" The man spat, quick and sharp. He was showing his teeth in a way that suggested he might strike, and in a town like Dry Creek that hint of danger sharpened everyone's senses. Luke's voice dropped into a cold level, like iron pouring. "You've spent enough time making yourself look important. Sit down." There were murmurs and a wave of indecision. People are cowards and braves by turns, and when a line is drawn they decide whether to stand inside it or outside. The man who had chosen to make spectacle now found himself facing a resistance he had not counted on. The room's atmosphere turned to a kind of electric tension. The man rose to his feet and his hand found the hilt of his temper like a gun at the hip. In a town with more grudges than policemen, tempers are like tinder. A confrontation flared. The man reached for something, words, perhaps a shove, and Luke's hand moved in a way that made clear he had patience for no further cruelty. The world, at that moment, reduced to a taut wire between a man and his own shame. There was a scuffle and the episode widened like a night-blooming flower. Men grabbed chairs and others made quick, clumsy efforts to intervene. The sheriff stepped forward as if there were a common sense to redirect the tide. Luke did not brandish a gun, though the men in such stories expected such theatrics. He had a shorter, more human intervention. He cut the man's escape from his own shame. He pulled him down to a level where the man either faced the consequences or would fall into them. When the fight ended, it did so not with blood spilt but with an aftershock of quiet. The man had been routed from his performative cruelty into a small, disgraced retreat. People who had cheered now watched with the uneasy knowledge that entertainment and cruelty are the same when they harm a person. The saloon's floor smelled of spilled drink and the ancient tang of old wood. It held the scuffs and dust of 100 fights. Ellen had not raised a hand. She had, in fact, been forced into the corner like a pressed flower. Her eyes shimmered with the hotness of near tears, unshed, the way someone might keep a lantern alight in a storm. She did not cry, not because she could not, but because she had learned the art of bearing things and then setting them down. When the room finally settled and the hush had the weight of an old blanket, Luke crouched by her side. He did not speak in grand gestures. He took her hand like a man taking an oath. "I'm sorry," he said simply, a word that carried within it 1,000 unspoken commitments. He did not offer the kind of grand rescue a play would prescribe. He offered a presence, a steadying, and I saw, and I fixed nothing because fixing is not always the right thing. But I knelt beside you, and that is where the change begins. Her eyes flicked up at him. There was gratitude there, but it was not the showy kind. It was the sort that warmed slowly and kept a person from freezing in the dark. It felt like a cup of tea given when there is a fever, practical, immediate, healing in its smallness. The public humiliation turned into a kind of turning point. People who had watched with careless eyes suddenly had to account for the fact that cruelty had consequences when someone else refused to let it stand. Men found themselves less likely to choose the low path when they thought someone might meet them there with a steady counter. Luke's act did not change hearts overnight, but it opened a space where new things might grow. In the quiet that followed, when the town had sobered from the spectacle and the saloon had returned to its usual hum, Ellen and Luke talked on the saloon's back porch where the lanterns made small islands of golden light. His voice, when he spoke of the brawl, was not the voice of a man asking to be thanked. He simply said, "I couldn't stand for it." "You didn't have to," she said. "I didn't think I could do otherwise," he replied. They sat in a silence that felt like a mutual agreement. It was not a contract, nor a vow. It was a soft, important truth. To be seen and to be defended can be different things. Defending is sometimes merely refusal to watch someone be harmed when you can act. Luke had chosen to act. After that day, the town's eyes began to loosen their tightness. They could still be cruel in moments of boredom and human failing. That never fully left. But it was harder to be petty when someone might be there to witness and say, "That's not allowed." People who had liked to hurl jibes found their audiences thinner. Or, if they could not help themselves, the town began to listen less and looked more and judged less kindly. Time moved on in its steady, relentless way. The Hollow family got a small cottage thanks to pooled funds and many small men and women who found the idea of kindness catching like a gum that sticks to shoes. The boy Tommy learned to fix a saddle and later to read, because someone lent him a primer. The saloon, where gossip had once been currency, became a bit more of a home where people learned, slightly, to care for one another. Luke and Ellen continued their slow, careful walk towards something that was not yet a romance in the fireworks sense, but was something far more honest. A companionship that grew out of shared labor, shared silence, and a mutual respect that felt almost organic. They did not rush to label anything. Every town has soapboxes. Neither of them wanted to climb onto one. They liked a private kind of tenderness that was revealed in small things. The way Luke would watch Ellen sleep after a long day painting fence. The way Ellen would iron his coat even though he said he did not mind the wrinkles. Their touches were practical at first. A hand on a boot strap, a palm on a shoulder, but slowly they began to contain more. A squeeze that said "I am here." A presence that said "I will be." Months turned into seasons and seasons into the kind of steady that made people trust a town to stand. They were not dramatic in their meeting of hearts. Their slow burn did not result in fireworks. It resulted in a hearth. There were dinners shared, gossip which was kinder in tone, as if the community had learned to choose gentler ways of speaking. Children played by the river and came to know the two of them as constants. A woman who could make a stew that warmed like a hymn, and a man who would throw his weight behind protection without too many words. Then, in the small hour before autumn bled into the cold, when the prairie was the color of dry wheat and the evening had a sweetness like the last slice of pie, the town gathered for a fair held on the edge of town, an event where neighbors traded goods, stories, and stale courtship in equal measure. People came with pies and jars of preserves, with quilts and jams and hand-carved spoons. It was a day when the town showed its best manners, when the seams of everyday life were resewn in public. Ellen wore a dress that was plain but clean. She had a small jar of pickled peaches that were her pride and a stack of cloth napkins sewn for sale. Luke arrived with a wheelbarrow of rope. He had braided himself and a look like a man who carried peace as if it were his duty. They walked together as if walking without scandal was a testimony. At the fair, someone asked Ellen to sit in a chair to judge a pie contest. She warmed to the role with her honest dignity and the way she could judge things fairly like a woman who had always balanced measures. She tasted a pie and found its crust perfect, its filling balanced like a good story. The town clapped and cheered softly when her expression liked what she tasted. And a small man who had once been loud and undignified tried to make a joke about how women always had a way with jam. People looked at him and did not laugh. Things had changed enough that his humor had nowhere to land. At the end of the day, as people packed their wares and the fare dwindled to murmurs, Luke and Ellen walked the boardwalk where the sign to the saloon creaked like an old sentinel. The light had a sweetness that felt like permission. There is a time when a heart, having been dwindled by years of steady service and small humiliations, needs a voice to say how it feels. For Ellen, that voice was not as dramatic as a trumpet. It was a whisper as precise as a thread. For Luke, what he had to say would not be a gesture grand enough to be recorded in songs. It would be a promise small and vital. They stopped by the river where the reeds whispered. Luke took her hand. No grand flourish, no theatrical bow. Just a steady, honest hand. The night was a sweep of stars, the kind that make you small and honest. Ellen, he said, the two-syllable name a weight and a blessing. You could have let the town make you small and it would have. You didn't. You gave of yourself without demand. That's worth more than any man in this town. She lifted her face and there was a softness there that had only surfaced in the last months. You didn't have to come around, she said, a smile like a small sun. I didn't, but I wanted to, he said, voice low and steady. I want to be with you, not as someone who saves you. God knows we don't need that, but as someone who stands beside you. She looked at him then, truly looked, and whatever boundary there had been, pain, past, fear, loosened and folded. I don't want rescue, she said. I want someone who will carry the weight with me, when needed. You've already done that, he answered. And I'd like to help carry more. That's my offer. No fine words, no paper vows. Help with the wood. Share the morning coffee. Sit on the porch. Maybe hold the other's hand when it's cold. She laughed, quiet and full. You have a way with plain promises. It's the only kind I ever trusted, he said. They walked back to the town with their hands held like a small barter made between two grown people. Rain would come again and bills would pile and the town would find new petty cruelties to peddle. But there was a salve larger than comfort, the choice to stand and the space to do it together. They had no need for a playbook. They had an honest arrangement that was a kind of mercy, to carry and to be carried. Months later, as the first frost white-creased the fields and the roofs took on a light dusting of winter's breath, the Hollow family's cottage stood roofed and warm. Tommy, who had once been a barely recognized rag of a boy, now stood with hands steady enough to feed horses and to lift crates. The boy was steady not because he had been taught by lecture, but because the town's network of unremarkable kindness had caught him and lifted him. He had been taught by work and the example of people like Ellen and Luke. Sometimes in the morning you could see him on the road with a lantern, walking toward the stables to do the early chores with the casual dignity of someone who belongs. Luke and Ellen's life was not a storybook. They fought about money and how to plant the garden and how to fuss with the cat that liked to knock things off the hearth. They had hired hands who were inept in ways that made their temper fray and neighbors who would still try to make clever jokes at Ellen's expense. But the shape of their days was a kind of sturdy home. He fixed things she could not, she mended things he had forgotten. They learned to speak small and true things to each other. Tease warm meant, I thought of you today. Fence needs mending meant, I will be here. Their love was the one that grows from 100 small considerations, not the thunderclap of a demonstration. In the spring, there was a baby's cry from a house down the lane, the sort of everyday miracle that made the world tilt gently for a time. At the post office, a woman would hand Ellen a letter and say without irony that Dry Creek was gentler since she and Luke took up a larger share of the kindness. People borrowed tools and sometimes money. They apologized if they'd been unkind. These were small things, but they mattered. The town had shifted. People remembered the day Luke stepped into the saloon and said a quiet enough. They told the tale in small, reverent whispers when they wanted to insist upon the law of the land. Respect. Children were taught to be brave not by loud words but by watching someone who looked like them. Steady, plain, not flashy. Just a person who would not step aside when cruelty made its rounds. They learned how to wring out the kettle and change the oil and be quiet when they had to be. They learned how to stand. Then, in a moment that would be the town's solace, as the sun slid low one final time and the light took on the color of old amber, Ellen looked at Luke by the fire. The stove made the room cozy as a clasp. The cat purred in the small lap of a rug, and someone had placed a kettle to warm on the stove like a small blessing. People had a way of saying everything the day requires in a quiet gesture. A cup of coffee poured, a blanket brought out, a look that said, "I'm here." Luke's eyes were kind, and his hands were calloused enough to show his work. His voice when he spoke was low and honest, like a man who had learned to save his breath for what mattered. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, voice small as the embers. Some might expect her to say no. The truth lived in the space between the bones. "I thought about it," she said. "I thought about what it might be like to walk away. But this," she touched his hand, "this is mine." He nodded.
"I'm glad."
They sat there, the world outside muffled by snow and the quiet of a town that had learned, slowly, to be kinder. In that small porch-lit room, with the kettle hissing and the cat circling their feet, Ellen felt the sum of small things fold into something larger than loneliness. She had once been called just the help. She had been dismissed and then recognized. She had been humiliated and then helped back to dignity. She had offered small kindnesses without fanfare and had them paid back with real presence. Luke lifted his head and looked at her, his voice a gravelly whisper that felt like an offering from the low places of his life. "The whiskey don't warm me anymore," he murmured, the confession more a fact than a plea. "Only you do." Ellen looked at him for a long moment. The light from the stove made his eyes look like slow rivers. She thought of all the small, steady things he had done. His silent help, his presence in the saloon, his refusal to let cruelty stand. She thought of how, like the kettle on the stove, small things had their own heat. She let herself smile, as small and unadorned as the promise of dawn. Her fingers laced with his, and the moment gave way to a quiet that felt like finality. There were more days to come, hard days, windy ones, a child's scrape that needed to be fixed, the occasional town's indignation that needed to be smoothed. Sometimes she would feel a sting of humiliation flare anew when someone said something thoughtless. More often she felt a warmth that was not drink but the steady press of a human hand that said she was seen. Luke would take to bringing in a sack of grain now and then, and Ellen would make space for him to sit by the stove without needing to perform. They cooked simple meals and learned the recipe for making a home that can withstand small catastrophes and larger ones too. When the winter loosened and the prairie leaned into green, Dry Creek celebrated a harvest that had been small and yet enough. The Hollow family's children ran through the fields with a kind of joy that tasted like a story told at bedtime. Tommy had found the steadiness that once eluded him. Mrs. Hargrave began, in her own awkward way, to speak less sharply in public, as if the town's new scale had affected even the hardest of feathers. At the end of one long day, as the sun settled and the stars began their watch, Ellen and Luke sat on the porch and looked over the town. The saloon sign creaked softly in the wind like an old refrain. The kettle on the back porch hissed, steam making halos in the air. Around them, the town exhaled, a collective letting go. "You ever regret it?" Ellen asked at last, voice the barest of threads. "Regret what?" he said. "Standing up for me," she said, honest. "Or staying?" He thought a moment and then smiled. "A small, honest thing. I regret the days I was not strong enough to do it sooner," he said. "But I don't regret choosing to stand with you now." They sat and watched the night bloom. People came by with small gifts, homemade pies, a jar of preserves, and thanked Ellen for her steady work. She thanked them back and returned to the stove where the kettle sang. The night was a band of small things, each one telling the town's story in a different voice. When the curtains finally fell across the town and most of the lights dimmed, Ellen turned to Luke and felt, without the need for melodrama, the warmth that came not from a bottle but from a shared life. It was gentler and truer than any bottle could promise. It was the real thing. A promise of someone whose hand would find yours in the dark, who would say nothing more grand than, "I'm here," his words, that whiskey had stopped warming him, and that she did, settled between them like a seal. They stayed sitting until the cold made them move to the warmth of the room. She made them tea at the stove. He took off his hat and placed it on the rack like a book set down. The cat circled their feet and chose the rug. They sat in the easy space where two lives had grown together in the small increments of daily devotion. If Dry Creek had a moral, it was not a sermon preached from the pulpit. It was a quiet acknowledgement carried in the town's behavior, that people who are steady and kind deserve to be dignified, that cruelty offered as opinion is still cruelty, that standing with someone in their hour of shame is sometimes the only way to change a town. The moral was not shouted. It was lived in the ordinary acts that make a place habitable. And if anyone asked about how the world changed, a man asked in a barroom and a woman asked at the general store, the answer would not be a declaration but a story told in the low voice of someone who had seen a small miracle. People might say, "If you saw yourself in her, remember, some roots grow in silence." They might tell it at the saloon with a cup of coffee passed across the table, or at the Morning Post with a spare biscuit. They might whisper it like a prayer to a child, telling them to be steady and kind. The town's final notes were not dramatic. They were the hush of a lamplight burning low, the steam of a kettle cooling on the stove, the creak of a door, the soft thud of boots on worn boards. There was a day when Ellen would step out on her porch and look at Luke in the morning light and know that the warmth that lived between them had nothing to do with whiskey and everything to do with choosing each other, again and again, like two people fastening a plow to a stubborn mule. And for all the noisy, petty things a town could do, a whisper, a steady act of standing and a simple, honest love changed Dry Creek. People learned that saving another's dignity often comes in the small acts. Sharing a blanket, standing up in a saloon, mending a fence. No one knew how to make a song about such things that would do them justice. The best they could do was speak plainly of the truth, that it takes courage to be kind and courage to accept help. There would always be storms. There would always be jokes told too sharp and those who missed the chance to be good. But in Dry Creek, people began to look at each other with a little more softness, as if they had learned how to hold an ember without burning a hand. They had learned to see people as worth more than their place on a ledger. They had learned that sometimes the only warmth you need comes from another person's steady presence. Years later, a child at the fair might ask, "Mama, what was the first thing that changed?" And a woman who had once been plain might say with a flat, honest timbre that made people warm inside like bread in an oven, "He stood up. He named the wrong thing wrong. And when he did, the town had to choose." She would drop her voice, and the child would listen as if it were a prayer. Ellen and Luke lived in a house with a roof that needed fixing every so often and a garden that gave them more than they expected. They kept a mantle for the things they could not name easily and a shelf for small jars of kindness. They would, on odd evenings, sit by the fire and recount the small battles and the small victories, and drink tea while the kettle steamed. The whiskey lay in the back of the cupboard, used sometimes for a cold day but less and less because there was no need for its numbness when warmth existed in human hands. And when the last long warmth of life seemed to cool a little and the world asked for softer things, they would fold their hands and remember. In the saloon and the store and the field, the story would be told the way stories in small towns always are, plain-spoken, patient, inevitable. A life measured not by the grand but by the faithful. The town might not have sung their names in altars of glory, but it had something better, a daily ledger of favors and returned kindness. It had the ordinary miracle of a man who kept his hand when a woman needed it, and a woman who kept the pot on the stove no matter the insult. It had a child who could read and a mother who slept easier. It had small kindnesses paid back and multiplied. If you saw yourself in Ellen's quiet steadiness, if the story of one who bends without breaking touched you, remember this story when you walk past someone on the boardwalk who looks like they might need something. Do not speak loud. Do not make it a sermon. Just be steady. Offer a cup. Offer a blanket. Offer a hand. Resist the small cruelty of a town that might prefer to watch. If you can, stand because standing is sometimes the only thing that makes a place better. She gave everything without asking. And finally, someone gave back. And that's how